Deep in the shadowed folds of the Appalachian Mountains, where the ancient ridges clawed at the sky like the fingers of forgotten gods, the year 1892 hung heavy with an unnatural chill. Fog clung to the valleys like a shroud, muffling the cries of distant creatures and the secrets buried beneath twisted roots. It was here, in a forsaken hollow far from the prying eyes of civilized folk, that the Blackwood Sisters dwelled, three figures of wild, untamed allure, their names whispered only in the dim glow of tavern lamps or around dying campfires. Eliza, the eldest, with hair like raven wings and eyes that pierced the soul, Miriam, whose laughter echoed like a siren's call through the pines, and young Lila, innocent in form yet harboring a darkness that made the bravest men shudder. They lived in a ramshackle cabin perched on the edge of oblivion, its walls groaning under the weight of untold sins, surrounded by woods that seemed to breathe with malevolent intent. Travelers spoke of them in hushed tones, lumbermen, wanderers, and fools seeking fortune in the untamed wilds who vanished without trace after straying too close. The air around their home carried a scent of earth and something sweeter, more forbidden, luring the unwary with promises unspoken. One such man, a sturdy trapper named Harlan Crow, had stumbled upon their lair on a moonless night, his lantern flickering against the encroaching gloom. He meant only to seek shelter from the storm, but the sisters' gaze held him fast, their voices weaving tales of warmth and wonders hidden in the night. As the wind howled outside, they drew him in with touches light as spider silk, awakening hungers he dared not name. Yet beneath the ecstasy lay a creeping dread, a sense that the mountains themselves watched, hungry for the essence of those who succumbed. By dawn, Harlan was gone, his screams swallowed by the forest, leaving only a blooded scrap of cloth snagged on a thorn. Whispers spread through the nearby settlements, tales of depraved rites where pleasure twisted into torment, and men were ensnared not by chains, but by desires that consumed them from within. The law turned a blind eye, for the mountains guarded their own, and those who ventured too deep returned changed, or not at all. But the enigma of the Blackwood Sisters lingered, a spine-tingling riddle etched into the annals of Appalachian lore, where the line between seduction and slaughter blurred into eternal night. In the autumn of 1892, the high ridges of Tucker County, West Virginia, were bleeding color into the frost, and every hollow carried the smell of wet leaves and distant wood smoke. Men had been disappearing for months, first one, then three, then seven, all sturdy lumberjacks and charcoal burners who worked the steep slopes above the Black Fork River. Their camps were found abandoned at dawn, coffee still warm on the coals, axes laid neatly beside half-cut logs, but no footprints leading away, no sign of struggle, only the faint, sickly sweet trace of something like crushed honeysuckle hanging in the cold air. The county sheriff had written the vanishings off as deserters chasing railroad work or drunkards lost to ravines, but the families would not let it rest. They pooled what little money they had and sent word down to Charleston for someone who could not be bought or frightened off. That someone was Deputy Marshal Elias Redfern, 34 years old, city-raised, a man who had tracked killers through the tenements of Pittsburgh and still carried a Spencer carbine from the war. Redfern arrived on the morning train with a single carpetbag, a warrant that was mostly bluff, and a reputation for never leaving a job unfinished. He began in the little settlement of Red Creek, asking questions in the company store and the one-room tavern where the lumbermen drank. The answers were always the same. The missing men had spoken of a cabin far up the hollow, past the laurel hells where the trail gave out and the ridges pinched together like a closing fist. They spoke of women there, 3 sisters, some said, living alone since their father hanged himself from a beech tree a decade earlier. Beautiful, the drinkers muttered into their jars of rye, but wrong, like a hymn played in the wrong key. Men who went looking for company did not come back. Those who spoke too loudly about going found their tongues suddenly heavy. Redfern listened without expression, paid for a bottle he never opened, and by dusk was riding a borrowed mule up the trace that climbed into the clouds. Night fell fast in the mountains, the way a curtain drops in a darkened theater. Fog rose from the river and swallowed the path behind him. Somewhere above, a whippoorwill called 3 times and stopped as if warned. The marshal loosened the colt on his hip, checked the loads in the Spencer, and kept riding toward the place the locals would not name aloud, only tracing a rough cross in the air when pressed, as though the sign itself might ward off what waited in the dark. The trail ended at a wall of rhododendron so thick it seemed to have grown deliberately to hide what lay beyond. Redfern tied the mule to a sourwood sapling and pushed through, thorns snagging his coat like small, insistent fingers. When he stepped into the clearing, the fog parted just enough to reveal the cabin, low, crooked, its chinking fallen out in places so the wind could sigh through the bones of the house itself. A single curl of smoke rose from the chimney, pale as a dying breath. They were waiting on the porch as though they had heard his heartbeat long before his boots cracked the first twig. The eldest stood tallest, barefoot despite the frost, her black hair loose and moving though there was no wind. She wore a dress the color of dried blood, cut from feedsack cloth yet somehow clinging like it had been stitched to her very skin. Her eyes were winter water gray, flat and depthless, reflecting the marshal back at himself smaller than he liked. When she smiled, the expression never reached those eyes, it stayed on her mouth the way a mask stays on a wall. Beside her leaned the second sister, hip cocked against the porch post, chewing idly on a sprig of mountain mint. She was smaller, sun-browned, with a scatter of freckles across cheekbones sharp enough to cut paper. Her dress had once been yellow, now faded to the color of old bone, and it was unlaced at the throat far enough to show the quick flutter of pulse beneath the skin. She watched Redfern the way a cat watches a bird through a window, curious, amused, already certain of the outcome. The youngest sat on the top step, knees drawn up under a quilt that smelled of wood smoke and something coppery. She could not have been more than 18, her hair the red gold of new pennies, and her eyes were wide, almost childlike, until the light shifted and they caught a greenish glint like moss under moving water. She did not smile at all. She simply stared, unblinking, as if memorizing the exact shape of his fear. None of them spoke at first. The silence stretched until the clearing itself seemed to hold its breath. Then the eldest tilted her head, a motion too smooth, almost serpentine, and the sound that came from her throat was soft, low, almost tender. "You're a long way from the flatland, Lawman." Her voice carried the mountain in it, slow, deliberate, every consonant shaped by centuries of isolation, yet beneath the drawl ran another note, something older, like wind scraping across standing stones. Redfern felt it slide along his spine and settle cold at the base of his skull. His hand twitched toward the colt, then stopped. Something in their stillness warned him that drawing iron here would be like drawing a knife in a dream, useless, and worse, impolite. The middle sister spat out the mint stem and laughed once, a short, bright sound that made the crows in the pines take flight. The youngest only tightened her grip on the quilt until her knuckles went white, and for an instant the cloth beneath her fingers looked wet, dark, as though something had bled through from the other side. Redfern spent his first night in the lean-to the sisters offered, a sagging shed that smelled of fox and wet ash. Sleep would not come. The cabin's single room glowed faintly through the warped boards, and every so often a shadow crossed the chink of light, tall, then shorter, then child-sized, moving in patterns that made no sense for three women going about ordinary chores. Around midnight the wind died altogether, and in that dead hush he heard chanting, low, throaty, three voices braided together in a language that tugged at memory the way a half-remembered dream tugs at the edges of waking. It was not English, not Shawnee, not the German the Kohlkamp preachers muttered. It felt older than any tongue men had bothered to name. At dawn he accepted the eldest sister's invitation to warm himself by their hearth. The cabin was darker than it should have been, the windows filmed with soot no fire could account for. A single shelf ran the length of one wall, crowded with jars of roots, bundles of dried bones too small for deer, and a row of leather-bound books so ancient the covers looked flayed rather than tanned. Eliza, she told him to call her that, as though the name were a gift, watched him with that same mask smile while he pretended to study the flames. He asked to wash the trail dust from his hands. She pointed him toward the back room, a narrow L lit only by a tallow candle that burned blue. There, beneath a slanting roof beam, stood a rough pine table. On it lay an open journal, its pages warped and water-stained, the ink faded to rust. Redfern had chased enough killers to know blood when he saw it used for writing. He turned the leaves with the tip of his knife. The earliest entries were in a neat, clerkish hand, their father's, he guessed, recording harvests, scripture, the price of pelts. Then the handwriting changed, grew wilder, the margins crowded with frantic sketches of circles within circles, antlers entwined with female forms, moons bleeding into cupped hands. One passage, dated 1879, read, "They come up through the roots when the frost breaks. They hunger as we hunger. The mountain gave us girls instead of sons because girls can carry them longer, birth them slower, keep the bargain sweet. Further on, a different ink, almost black. First blood at 13 binds the covenant. The men are only the cup. Pleasure is the blade. A crude family tree had been drawn beneath the words. At its head stood a symbol Redfern had once seen carved on a Cherokee burial stone, something the old people refused to name. From that mark descended 3 names, Eliza, Miriam, Lila, each circled in red, each connected by a single, pulsing line that ran downward and vanished off the edge of the page, as though whatever they served still waited below. A final note, scrawled sideways in a hand that shook. We feed it what it taught us to crave, or it feeds on us. The candle guttered though no wind stirred. Behind him the floorboard creaked, and the scent of crushed honeysuckle flooded the little room, thick enough to choke on. 3 nights after Redfern's arrival, a stranger came up the hollow riding a sway-backed mare gone lame from the climb. He gave his name as Josiah McCoy, a traveling preacher out of Knoxville selling Bibles and patent tonic between revivals. Tall, raw-boned, with preacher-black coat and a voice that could shake sin out of a stone, he carried the easy confidence of a man who believed the Lord rode shotgun wherever he went. The sisters spotted him from the porch while they were drawing water. Miriam waved as if she'd been expecting company for Sunday supper. Redfern watched from the lean-to doorway, uneasy. McCoy tied his mare, doffed his wide hat, and climbed the steps quoting Psalm 23 with a smile bright enough to shame the sun. The women listened like they were hearing music for the first time. Eliza took his hat, fingers brushing the sweatband longer than necessary. Miriam offered cider laced with something that smelled of apples left too long in the rain. Lila simply stared, quilt pulled tight to her chin even though the day was warm, her green-glint eyes fixed on the preacher's throat where the pulse beat steady and strong. By dusk the mare stood untended, reins dangling. Inside the cabin, lamplight painted gold across the walls and laughter spilled out in bright, unnatural waves. Redfern heard the preacher's baritone soften, then break into a wondering hush. He heard Miriam's low teasing, Eliza's murmured scripture twisted into something older, and Lila's sudden sharp intake of breath like a child seeing snow fall upward. The chanting started soon after, soft at first, almost a lullaby, rising and falling with the rhythm of bodies moving in ways no hymnal ever described. Hours slid past. The moon climbed white and swollen above the pines. Redfern sat on a stump with the Spencer across his knees, telling himself he was only keeping watch for wolves. The sounds from the cabin grew stranger, a wet, rhythmic slapping, a man's voice pleading in a language that was half prayer, half surrender. Once, the door opened a crack and candlelight spilled across the yard in a red slash. He saw McCoy on his knees, shirt torn open, head thrown back while 3 pale shapes moved over him like smoke-given claws and mouths. Toward the tag end of night the noises stopped as suddenly as a slammed gate. Silence rushed in so complete the crick of a single cricket sounded like a gunshot. Then came one high, shattering cry, not pain, not pleasure, but something rawer, as though the preacher's soul had been hooked out through his open mouth. After that, nothing. No footsteps, no closing door, no creak of the porch boards under retreating weight. At first light Redfern found the mare still waiting, eyes rolling white. The cabin door stood ajar. Inside, the room was tidy, quilts folded, cups washed, fire banked to embers. Only the preacher's hat remained, hanging neatly on its peg, the sweatband dark and fresh. A single drop of something thick slid slowly down the brim and dangled, trembling, refusing to fall. The morning after McCoy vanished, Redfern followed a faint trail of broken ferns behind the cabin. It led him 100 yards upslope to a place the mountain seemed to have folded in on itself, a narrow cleft overhung with laurel so old the trunks were white as bone. The air there tasted metallic, like licking a knife. He pushed through and found the altar. It was not grand. No standing stones, no carved idols, only a flat slab of shale the length of a man, set waist-high on 2 stumps. The surface was black and shining, as though it had been oiled every day for 100 years. Runoff from the ridge had worn shallow channels across it, channels that met in a cupped hollow at the lower end. The hollow was full. Dark, viscous, still warm when he forced himself to touch it. The smell hit him then, copper, musk, and that cloying honeysuckle sweetness turned sour. Around the stone the ground had been swept clean with a hemlock bough, but the bough lay discarded nearby, bristles stiff with dried blood. Someone had arranged offerings in a half-circle, a lock of auburn hair tied with blue ribbon, a brass wedding band bent open like a mouth, a pocket testament open to the Song of Solomon with certain verses underlined in rust brown. Between each offering lay small white objects, finger bones, he realized, picked clean and polished by careful teeth. Redfern's boot nudged something soft. A preacher's coat, folded neatly, the black cloth torn at the shoulders as though claws had ripped it free in one motion. Beneath it, half hidden under leaves, was McCoy's leather Bible. The cover had been sliced open and the pages hollowed out. Inside the cavity nestled a lump of something pale and glistening, veined faintly blue, still pulsing with a slow, deliberate rhythm that matched no human heart Redfern had ever heard. He knelt, bile rising, and saw the final detail. Carved into the underside of the slab, hidden unless you knew to look, were 3 sets of initials, EB, MB, LB, each followed by a tally of short vertical marks. Eliza's column held 27. Miriam's 31. Lila's, only recently begun, already numbered 9. The newest mark was still wet, the gouge in the stone raw and bleeding sap. From somewhere deeper in the cleft came the soft scrape of a bare foot on rock. Redfern straightened, hand dropping to the colt, but the sound did not repeat. Only the slow drip from the altar's lip into the leaves below, steady as a clock counting down to something that had waited under these mountains long before the first white man ever laid an axe to timber. That evening the sky pressed down like wet wool, and the first hard frost silvered the clearing. Redfern sat on the porch steps sharpening his knife because it gave his hands something to do while the sisters moved inside, quiet for once, the way animals grow quiet before an earthquake. The youngest, Lila, came out alone. She carried no lamp. The darkness seemed to part for her the way water parts for a thrown stone. She settled 2 steps above him, quilt wrapped tight, and for a long while said nothing at all. Then, so softly he felt the words more than heard them, she began to speak. "It started with Mama," she said. "Before any of us drew breath. She was took by fever after birthing a stillborn boy. Papa carried her up the ridge at dusk, laid her on the black stone, and begged the mountain to give her back. Anything, he swore. Anything it wanted." Lila's voice stayed level, almost dreamy, the way a child recites a lullaby learned at a cradle that rocked over hell. It didn't want her life. It wanted a door. A blood door that stayed open. Papa thought he could pay once and be done. He cut his own arm to the bone and let it drink. Next morning Mama walked down healthy as spring rain, smiling like she'd only stepped out for kindling. 9 months later she bore Eliza. 2 years after that, Miriam. When I came, Mama finally understood the price wasn't paid off, it was only beginning. She pulled the quilt tighter, though the cold did not seem to touch her. Every hunger we feel, it taught us. Every dream that wakes us wet and shaking, it planted. The men ain't the sacrifice, Marshall. They're the rent. We give it what it craves through them, pleasure sharp enough to cut the soul loose, and it lets us keep breathing a little longer. Eliza says we're brides. Miriam says we're wolves wearing girlskin. I just know when the moon's right I can taste their hearts beating in my mouth before I ever touch them. Redfern's knife stopped moving. In the window behind Lila he saw the other 2 standing motionless, watching their little sister the way a man watches a fuse he's already lit. Sometimes, Lila whispered, leaning close enough that her breath stirred the hair at his temple, I try to remember what it felt like to be hungry for ordinary things. Warm bread. A hand that didn't bruise. But the mountain's older than wanting, and it's patient. It'll wait till even screaming feels like singing. She reached out then, small fingers brushing the back of his wrist where the pulse hammered, and for an instant her eyes went full green, luminous as Farksfy, showing him something vast and lidless looking back from behind her child face. The 3rd night after Lila's confession, the moon rose full and wrong, bloated orange like a pumpkin left too long in the field. Redfern had not slept in earnest since arriving, he only dozed in snatches, waking each time the cabin door opened and closed with no footstep to explain it. Around midnight the silence cracked open. A single, low note, not quite a woman's moan, not quite a wolf's howl, drifted down from the ridge and settled over the clearing like oil on water. He was on his feet before the echo died, Spencer in hand, boots silent on the frozen grass. The cabin stood dark, no lamplight, no fireglow, only the faint smell of honeysuckle now turned rank, as if every blossom in the county had rotted at once. Then he saw them, 3 pale shapes gliding between the tree trunks upslope, moving faster than any woman should, bare feet making no sound on the frost-brittle leaves. Redfern followed. The trail climbed steep, twisting through stands of spruce so dense the moonlight barely dripped through. Each time he thought he'd lost them, a soft laugh floated back, Miriam's, bright and taunting, pulling him onward like a hook through the ribs. The air grew warmer as he climbed, thick, humid, wrong for November. Sweat soaked his shirt though his breath still plumed white. He burst into a clearing he had never seen by day, a perfect circle where no trees grew, ringed by standing stones half sunk in moss. The sisters waited in the center, naked now, skin luminous as moonlit marble. They did not look cold. They looked hungry. Eliza raised one hand and the forest answered. Shapes peeled away from the trunks, men, dozens of them, yet not men. Faces he recognized from reward posters and family tintypes, eyes milk-white, mouths slack, moving with the jerky grace of puppets on frayed strings. They wore the clothes they had died in, flannel shirts stiff with old blood, suspenders hanging loose, boots laced wrong. The missing lumbermen. All of them. Miriam clapped once, delighted, and the dead things began to dance, slow and obscene, hips rolling to music only the sisters heard. Lila stood apart, arms wrapped around herself, rocking on her heels as if trying not to join in. Redfern raised the Spencer, but the barrel trembled. Where the moonlight touched the metal it turned black, frost racing along the octagon like spilled ink. Eliza turned her head all the way around, too far, impossibly far, and smiled with too many teeth. Come dance, Marshall, she crooned, voice layered, as though every man she had ever drained spoke through her at once. We saved the best illusions just for you. The nearest corpse, Harlan Crow, the trapper whose scrap of shirt had started it all, stepped forward, arms outstretched. Its mouth moved, shaping Redfern's own name in a voice that belonged to his long-dead mother. The smell of honeysuckle flooded his lungs until he gagged on sweetness. The clearing tilted, the trees leaned inward, and for one heartbeat he saw himself already among them, shirt torn open, eyes white, swaying forever in that silent circle. Dawn found the clearing empty, the standing stones dulled to ordinary granite, no footprints but Redfern's own. He staggered back down the ridge with the Spencer hanging loose in his arms, the barrel warm as living flesh. The sisters were at the cabin as if they had never left, Eliza splitting kindling with slow, deliberate strokes, Miriam humming while she scrubbed a tin basin, Lila on the porch steps twisting a strip of red flannel around her finger until the tip went purple. The humming stopped the instant Redfern crossed the yard. Miriam's eyes flicked to him, bright and sharp, then slid past to where Eliza stood with the axe resting against her shoulder. Something passed between them too quick for words, a current of pure venom. Eliza set the axe down gently, almost lovingly, and walked inside without looking at either sister. Miriam followed, hips swaying loose, but her hands were clenched so tight the knuckles cracked like green wood in a fire. Lila stayed on the step, rocking now, the red flannel strip unraveling, blood threading from beneath it where she had worried the skin raw. Redfern heard the voices rise almost immediately, low at first, then vicious. Eliza's voice never lifted, but every word cut clean. Miriam answered in a hiss that climbed into a snarl. A single sentence carried clear through the open door, he was mine to finish, not yours to toy with. Then the sound of something heavy hitting the wall, a grunt, the scrape of claws on pine. He stepped inside in time to see Miriam lunge, nails raking across Eliza's cheek, drawing 4 perfect lines that welled dark. Eliza did not flinch. She caught Miriam's wrist, twisted until bone showed white, and slammed her younger sister against the table hard enough to splinter a leg. Jars of roots and small bones crashed to the floor. The air filled with dust and the sudden reek of old blood waking up. Lila darted between them, small hands pushing at chests that would not yield. Stop, stop, it'll come early if we spill ours, she cried, voice cracking into something too old for her throat. Neither sister looked at her. Miriam bared teeth gone too long, too sharp, and drove her forehead into Eliza's nose. Cartilage crunched. Blood spattered the hearthstones like thrown rubies. Eliza laughed then, a sound like ice breaking on a deep river, and shoved Miriam backward into the open cupboard. Bottles of clear liquid, corn liquor or something worse, shattered, soaking both women until they gleamed. For one heartbeat they froze, staring over Lila's head, chests heaving, eyes reflecting the same green glint Redfern had seen in the clearing. Then the floorboards beneath them rippled, as though something huge shifted its weight far below the foundation. The sisters felt it at the same instant. Their rage flickered, replaced by something close to fear. Blood dripped from Eliza's nose onto the boards and soaked in instantly, greedily. The temperature in the room plunged. Breath plumed white. The spilled liquor began to crawl, forming thin red rivulets that sought the cracks between the planks like iron filings seeking a lodestone. Miriam's snarl died in her throat. Eliza's bleeding face went slack. They looked at each other across the wreckage of the room, jealousy suddenly small against the older hunger stirring awake beneath their feet. The moment the spilled blood vanished between the planks, the cabin itself seemed to inhale. Lamps guttered though no wind moved. The door swung shut on its own with a soft, final click. Redfern felt the colt grow heavy on his hip, heavier than lead, as though the mountain had poured its own weight into the iron. He took one step back and found the wall already at his shoulders. The room had shrunk, or he had grown, or the distance between things had simply forgotten its proper measure. Eliza wiped the blood from her lip with the back of her hand, smearing it across her cheek like war paint. Miriam's chest still rose and fell in quick, furious pulls, but her eyes were fixed on the floorboards now, wide and glassy. Lila began to whimper, a thin, reedy sound that climbed the scale until it hurt to hear. Then the scent returned, honeysuckle gone bad, thick as syrup, sliding down Redfern's throat and coating his tongue. His knees buckled though he had not meant them to. The Spencer clattered from his fingers and did not fall. It hung in the air a foot above the boards, spinning slowly, barrel pointing at his heart like an accusing finger. Eliza moved first. She crossed the room in 2 gliding steps and laid her palm flat against his chest, right over the badge. Her hand was furnace hot. Miriam circled behind him, breath ragged against the nape of his neck. Lila stayed where she was, rocking, but her eyes never left his face. The walls dissolved into running shadow. Suddenly he stood in the moonlit clearing again, only now the standing stones were teeth, and the circle was a mouth. The dead men were gone. In their place stood every woman he had ever wanted and never dared touch, the Pittsburgh widow with the sad laugh, the sergeant's daughter who kissed him behind the cannon shed at Shiloh, even his own mother as she had looked the morning she braided his hair for school. They moved toward him clothed only in moonlight, arms open, mouths shaping his name in voices that cracked his ribs like green wood. Eliza's hand slid lower, unbuttoning his coat with deliberate care. Miriam's teeth grazed the tendon at the base of his neck, not breaking skin, only reminding him how easily she could. Pleasure flared sudden and blinding, a white-hot wire pulled through every vein. He heard himself make a sound he had no name for. Beneath it all ran another sensation, colder, patient, something vast and eyeless tasting him through their mouths, measuring the weight of his soul the way a butcher tests meat with a thumb. The women's faces flickered, beauty, hunger, sorrow, ecstasy, shifting faster than thought, until he could no longer tell where his memories ended and their need began. Lila's small hand found his then, fingers sticky with someone else's blood, and she pressed something into his palm, a single black feather, still warm from a living breast. Her lips brushed his ear, barely a breath. "Hold tight when it starts to drink," she whispered, "or you'll forget which one of us you are." The black feather burned in Redfern's fist like a coal. He clenched it so hard the quill sliced his palm, and the sudden sting of real pain snapped the world back into focus. The cabin walls reformed around him, solid again, but wrong, tilted a few degrees off true, as though the mountain had shrugged while no one watched. Blood dripped from his hand onto the floorboards and did not soak in this time. Instead it beaded, bright as mercury, then rolled toward the hearth of its own accord. Eliza and Miriam stood frozen mid-motion, arms still half-raised, mouths open on words that never came. Their eyes had gone milk-white, pupils swallowed entire. Lila alone seemed untouched, but her face was turned toward the floor, listening to something moving beneath it, something that made the boards drum like a distant heartbeat growing louder. The temperature plummeted so fast the spilled liquor froze in mid-crawl, crackling into scarlet lace. Frost raced across the windows in branching veins that looked almost like antlers. Redfern felt the Colt lift itself from his holster, slow and inevitable, the cylinder rotating though no finger touched it. 6 cartridges slid out one by one and hung spinning in the air like iron wasps. Then the floor erupted. Not with violence, but with patience. Planks lifted gently, lovingly, curling back the way petals open to moonlight. Beneath them was not earth but darkness so complete it had weight, and in that darkness something unfolded, vast, jointless, older than bone. It rose in slow coils, tasting the air with 1,000 tongues that left wet trails of phosphorescence on the rafters. The sisters dropped to their knees as one, heads thrown back, throats bared in identical surrender. Redfern tried to move and could not. The feather in his hand had rooted, barbs sinking through skin and tendon until he felt it brush the bones of his wrist. Lila's voice reached him from very far away, thin as spider silk. "It's done waiting. We broke the bargain when we fought." The thing from below spread wider, filling the cabin until the walls groaned and began to bow outward. Where its shadow touched, wood turned black and soft as rot. Eliza made a sound that was half sob, half laugh, and crawled forward on hands and knees, pressing her bleeding face to the darkness like a penitent kissing the hem of a priest. Miriam followed, snarling, defiant even now, nails scraping furrows in the floor as she was dragged by unseen tides. Lila stayed longest, small hand still tangled with Redfern's, until the pull became too strong and her fingers slipped free one by one. In the instant before the darkness closed over them, Redfern saw the sisters' outlines blur and merge with silhouettes far taller, antlered, ancient, as though the mountain were simply reclaiming shapes it had only lent them for a little while. Then the cabin was empty. The door hung open to a morning bright and ordinary. Frost glittered on the porch rails. Somewhere a jay scolded. Redfern stood alone amid the wreckage, the black feather gone from his hand, only a thin white scar across his palm to show it had ever been there. The Spencer lay on the floor, cartridges back in the cylinder, hammer down. The sisters' dresses hung on their pegs, neatly buttoned, waiting for bodies that would never fill them again. Down the hollow, the trail was already growing over with laurel. By spring no one would find the clearing. By next winter no one would remember the name Blackwood had ever been spoken aloud. Only sometimes, when the moon rose full and orange over Tucker County, men camping too high on the ridge swore they heard women laughing far away, 3 voices braided into one long, hungry note that made dogs whimper and strong men check their rifles and hurry down before dark. Redfern rode out at noon, saying nothing to the waiting families in Red Creek. He left the badge on the sheriff's desk without a word and took the first train west. Years later, old men in saloons claimed they saw him once, sitting alone in a corner, staring at a scar shaped like a black feather that never faded, no matter how much whiskey he poured across it.